Is Fortnite's building too hard? The skill ceiling in Fortnite is just unbelievably high, and for what a lot of people consider to be a kid's game, Fortnite has to be one of the highest skill gap games of any video game out there. There's a massive skill to learning the battle royale genre of games generally. There's drop spots, rotations, power positions, and much more. And then of course there's also all of the shooter elements like aim, movement, decision making in fights, and all that other stuff. It's the building mechanic that truly sets Fortnite apart from any other battle royale or any shooter for that fact. This skillful core mechanic has kept millions of players interested for over 7 years, and it's also the reason that a lot of players never get into Fortnite. In this 7 years since Fortnite's release, the speed and skill that the best players in the world have gotten to is truly amazing. It's not just the top players in the world that are talented at building. The average player can now build fast, and the longer Fortnite is out for, the better the average player base becomes. If you're a competitive player striving to make earnings in online competition, the average skill of the opponents in your lobbies are ever increasing as time goes on. If you don't play enough, you can easily fall behind and get worse. But this is for tournaments and prizings for the best players, so this just means that as time goes on, the competition gets harder and it gets more competitive. But this same concept still applies down to the average public player as well. The average player in pubs and ranked can build well. There's a lot of players in these lobbies who have never entered a tournament but are incredibly skilled mechanically. Same thing goes with creative. We've all gone to like a random creative fill and just seen the most insane player ever, and then check their Fortnite tracker to see that they've just never played a tournament. If you can only build a little bit, you have a significant advantage over someone who can't build at all or is entirely horrible at it. For average players, there is a direct connection between how good your building mechanics are and then how good of a fighter you are in Fortnite. This actually creates an interesting issue where, ironically, Fortnite, often seen as a very casual game, can be really difficult to enjoy casually as the barrier to entry is so high. On the flip side, the high skill gap actually works really well in a competitive setting because Fortnite is just hard, and hard games usually reward the most skilled players and teams. So Fortnite is actually kind of better as a competitive game than a casual game. This channel discusses competitive Fortnite content, so why am I even making such a big point out of a casual issue? Well, the barrier to entry is a barrier for new players to come into the game, which is a barrier for those players to get into competitive Fortnite as well. If people are struggling in public matches, how are they ever going to want to play a tournament? Fundamentally, more players playing tournaments shows Epic Games that their large investment into competitive is paying off, and they keep it going for many more years to come. Even forgetting tournaments for a second, more players playing Fortnite means more income for Epic Games, which in turn keeps Fortnite going for many more years to come, which I'm sure we all want. So what is it that actually makes building so hard? Well, it's actually not the building part of building. There's only 4 different actions you need to learn to build, which is 1 to place the wall, 1 to place the floor, 1 to place a cone, and 1 to place a ramp. So 4 buttons, 4 actions, and it's not really that difficult to actually master these. To prove this, I decided to go on controller, which I have not played for, I don't know, like 4 years or something like that, and set a 15-minute timer. And I want to see how well I can build by the end of that 15 minutes. To start, I was kind of horrible, I'm not gonna lie. But after around like 5 to 10 minutes, I'd already relearned a lot of the basic mechanics like 90s and some tarping and stuff. Obviously, not mechanical goat by any means. But after 10 minutes, I thought, I'm just gonna jump into a 1v1 random fill and see what happens. And I could still fight. Not great by any means, but I could still get a kill every now and then. I also had to get a couple clips on KBM for fun though. But it's not like the actual building element is the hardest part. What is difficult is building and editing. Now, editing by itself is not actually that difficult. If you go into a random edit course and you try to go through it, you'll realize that you can probably edit relatively quickly, but it's when you combine building and editing together that makes mechanics very difficult. You're no longer limited just to the 4 builds as your actions. You now have to also select edits, select tiles, and confirm edits, and place all those builds at the same time. And now, regardless if you play controller or keyboard mouse, you're probably running out of buttons. If you're on keyboard mouse and you want to edit, for example, you have to take your finger off of the move right key, which for most people is D, to press F, which means your movement is relatively limited. Then you also have to remember sprinting, which speeds up all of these actions too, and is yet again another button you have to repeatedly press. So individually, all of these different elements from mechanics are not actually that difficult. Building's not that hard, editing's not that hard, movement's not that hard, sprinting is not that hard, but it's the combination of all of these together that make becoming very mechanical extremely difficult. So the building mechanics in Fortnite make it an incredibly difficult game, and that fundamentally stops a lot of players from playing builds and then from playing competitive Fortnite, which, as we know, is bad. However, on the flip side, the difficulty of the mechanics is also what keeps a lot of people playing, because it's a fun and skillful game to play, and max piecing 200 someone is better than any feeling any other game will ever give you. So how can this problem be fixed? Well, in February of 2018, with the release of Fortnite Season 3, Fortnite added turbo building. Now, prior to this, you had to individually click each build piece to place them. Turbo building meant that you could just now hold down your left click to place button and builds would infinitely place. Naturally, this massively increased the skill ceiling for building mechanics as players could now just build much faster. And if you never played back then, you can actually test this by turning the setting off and see how awful it feels. Now, recently, Fortnite just released a permanent Fortnite OG mode that's meant to replicate Chapter 1. And some people think that turbo building should be disabled in this mode to replicate what it was really like there. We want to strategize and build forts. The theory here being that if building was slower and clunkier, then it would feel like 2017 when everyone sucked at building and Fortnite would have that real OG feeling again and you could come back on and just have fun with your friends. So in the long term, if building is less overpowered or less important, then bad players have a better chance. Well, I decided to test this theory. So I hosted a single solo custom game with a prize pool of $100 for the player who won the match. But the catch is that every single player had to turn turbo building off. Initially going into this, I thought that nobody would be able to build at all. And it would kind of be like Kerry said, you'd have to be extremely strategical. Then with the end game where it's a lot of tarping and boxing up is crucial, I thought this would be a complete mess. Without turbo building, I basically just thought that everyone would just spray each other 24/7 as players wouldn't be able to hold their walls as easily. But honestly, this really wasn't the case. Most people's mechanics were relatively similar to what you'd see in an actual tournament match. If you watch the endgame from a wide camera, it looks very similar to any other endgame in a standard tournament. Sure, it's a little bit more clunky and slow if you watch from each player's perspective, but players can pretty much do all of the same mechanics that they need to for a competitive match. Sure, if you put them in creative, they probably wouldn't be able to do as many triple edits or any of the funky stuff that you see Pierbot do right now, but making building harder doesn't in any way change who is good and who isn't. So I don't think this change would positively impact the bad players. They would still just be bad players who can't build very well. Plus, Epic Games already tried something like this back in Chapter 1, where they changed the turbo build time from 0.005 to 0.15 seconds to try and nerf the strength of defensive box fighting, and people hated it. The impact of this was basically like playing on 100+ ping from whatever you are currently playing right now, so it felt horrendously laggy for everyone, even if you were on good ping. Low-key might actually be one of the worst patches in Fortnite history. Thankfully, they reverted this change after a few hours, but making building less impactful, I don't think is a particularly good long-term solution, because this doesn't help the newer players who are bad at building, and it just makes it frustrating for the players who are good at it. So if nerfing building isn't a good idea, by any means, for anyone, don't do it, Epic. Don't do it. Should Fortnite make building easier? Well, the few attempts Epic Games have made at this have all been received actually relatively well. Firstly, there's turbo building, which we've already mentioned. Secondly, they then added edit on release, which this feature makes editing slightly faster as you no longer have to press confirm edit, and this too was well received. And then the third, which is the most recent feature which was added, which was simple edit, a not so well received feature. Traditionally, to edit a wall, you have to select the build piece with the edit button, select the tiles with your left click on your mouse or the right trigger on controller, and then either press your edit button to confirm the edit, or if you're using edit and release, just release the select tiles button and it'll confirm the edit automatically. But with simple edit, all you have to do is aim your crosshair at a certain part of the wall and press edit once. The edit you choose depends on where your crosshair is placed. So if you look at top right, you can do a top right edit. If you look at the bottom right, you can do a bottom 4 tile edit. Now this feature actually removes a lot of the awkwardness of editing and makes it much faster, because you no longer have to press all of the actions that you would with editing. It's no longer 3 actions per edit, it's now just 1. So because simple edit cuts down the amount of actions needed to do a single edit, it will always be faster because it's just more efficient. Take this scenario here where you have a ramp and a wall between you and an opponent. With simple edit on, all you need to do is press your edit button twice and you've immediately got an opportunity to take a shot. Now, no matter who you are, there is a 0% chance that you'll be able to do that as quickly with the setting turned off. Not only is this faster, but your crosshair no longer has to flail around while selecting tiles on an edit, making it much easier to hit shots after you edit, because you can pretty much watch the opponent the entire time and make sure your crosshair is placed in the right position. Because the edit is instant, you're also not giving away anything to the opponent. Usually the other player can recognize that you're going to edit due to you pulling out your blueprints, so they can predict it, but with a simple edit, your edit just happens instantly, so there's 0 time for the other player to recognize what you're doing. Martos recently tried this out for a video, and he said that if it didn't have so many downsides, you'd probably switch to simple edit. These downsides are that you can't scout through a cone because you'll just automatically confirm the edit if you try to, and you also can't reset instantly as there's a small delay. Now the delay is not massive, but any good player will recognize that this small delay is enough to get shot through and that it's significantly worse than scroll wheel reset. You also can't use it in tournaments at the time of recording, so that's obviously a massive negative for any competitive player. So historically, things that have made building easier, like turbo building and edit on release, have been very well received. So what makes simple edit so different? Well, honestly, it just kind of makes it too easy. Sure, there's like an initial fun of piecing up someone because it feels so much easier when you use simple edit. However, the clips just don't feel quite as good. A lot of the satisfaction that Fortnite has is in the fact that it is quite difficult, and therefore getting a good clip, getting a good elim, full boxing, full piece, max 200 in someone is satisfying. But with simple edit, it quite frankly is not as satisfying. I'm not going to say it's not fun and it's not cool, but it just isn't the same. A lot of the newer players are enjoying it. If you've gone into a random fill game, you'll see that most bad players are now using it. So obviously a lot of the newer players do think that it's beneficial, and I also believe that it probably is if you're going to stick with it long term. There's also not just newer players, there are also more OG content creators like Ninja, Courage, Lupo, and Tim, who are now also just playing build mode, mainly because the Fortnite OG map sucks for zero build, but I think all of them are using the simple edit feature, so the feature is well received by the casual audience, just not the more hardcore player base.
Officially a simple edit god, by the way. I've decided, I've literally like made the decision. I know I keep saying that, but like just watch, all right?
But if we make building easier for the newer players, you also have to remember that building and editing gets easier for the existing and pro player base. So in a world where simple edit would allow you to look through cones and you could do an instant reset, sure, it would make this much easier for the newer players, but for the pros, they would also get an increase in speed. In pub games, in ranked, all of those players will also get a boost to their speed and their mechanical ability because it's getting easier for everyone. But that would mean that, sure, it's easier to build and edit for the lower level players, but this doesn't actually close the skill gap at all because everyone would be getting better. And to date, we're yet to see a pro player or someone with incredibly fast mechanics try simple edit out for a week, a month, or a few months. A, because it's not been out that long, and B, because, well, it's not allowed in tournaments, so why would they? But I do fear that this setting is so fast that it would really punish the most minor of mistakes. Take wall replacing as an example. Right now, if you're trying to wall replace someone, the average player can't just take a wall, edit it, whip out the shotgun, and take a shot before the other player can react. However, with simple edit, you can just instantly edit the wall as soon as you take it, giving the opponent zero chance to react. Now, pros can do this, but this is a skill. However, giving this to everyone really will punish the most minor of mistakes. Similarly, if you go into the wall at slightly the wrong time, the opponent can just instantly create an opening and hit an easy shot onto you. It also then becomes almost impossible to predict people who are through multiple layers of builds, as we mentioned earlier with the wall and ramp example, as there's no way you can read that the other player is going to make a double edit that quickly. So this is a bit of a problem. If you make building more difficult by removing turbo build, for example, the bad players are still bad and the best players are still the best players. If you make building easier with mechanics like simple edit, the bad players are still bad and the best players are still the best players. Hell, even if you remove building altogether, most of the zero build players are still just the best players and pros who play zero build tournaments. So Fortnite's building is incredibly difficult, yes, but that is part of the beauty. But are there actually changes that can be made to building and editing that can benefit everyone without making it not feel like Fortnite? Well, first is actually implementing a part of simple edit that I really like. Rather than selecting tiles once you've selected a build piece, if once you selected a specific build piece to edit, then you just had to look in a certain area, similar to how simple edit is now, and then click to select and edit, this seems to make way more sense than the current tile option. This would be slightly faster because it's removing some of the awkwardness of selecting the tiles, but it wouldn't be the macro speed that simple edit is, and I think this would still feel like Fortnite. The normal simple edit feature is missing quite a lot of edits. This would also still mean that you can scout through cones, and you could use scroll wheel reset with this too. So this wouldn't necessarily be better than the regular selecting tile mode, and it wouldn't have the macro speed of the simple edit feature as it currently is right now, but it's a nice place that goes in the middle that removes some of the awkwardness, which allows newer players to get into editing, whilst at the same time actually making this kind of applicable for competitive players. The second thing that really sucks about building is the fact that you have to use scroll wheel reset. Now, before people figured out what scroll wheel reset really was, you first have to select the build piece, then you have to press the reset button, then you had to press confirm edit again. So it was 3 different actions. Now, by binding all of these onto one scroll wheel, you can basically just instantly reset, getting rid of the awkwardness of this feature. But why do we have to use a scroll wheel reset for this? Why is this not just one button where it instantly resets a wall where you press it? The obvious massive downside here is if you're a controller player, you don't have a scroll wheel, so this is multiple actions for those players. The third thing I would improve and fix about editing is blueprint editing. Why, when you pull out your blueprint, does this increase the range that you can edit? This makes literally no sense. You can grab edits around 20% further away, but this just seems completely unnecessary, as this should just be the standard distance where you can select tiles from. And fourth, and most importantly of all, for newer players, there should just be a built-in tutorial to teach you how to build and edit. This system is so incredibly complicated, and there is nowhere for newer players to learn in-game. I'm sure there are some creative maps that players have made. I've not gone out of my way to look through it yet, but the fact that Fortnite doesn't just give you something is a real barrier to entry. With mechanics like building and editing, newer players are always going to struggle with it. But by removing as many barriers as possible, you're giving them the highest chance of learning to build, and then also potentially moving on into tournaments. But at the end of the day, Fortnite's building is just incredibly difficult, and that is actually the beauty of the game. It's one of the many reasons that players still play it 7 years later. So sure, the difficulty of building is why a lot of players never get into builds, but it's also why most people still actually play it. And if you moan about that, just get good or play another game. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier in this video is that sprinting makes building and editing way more difficult because it increases speed. And I actually think sprinting is one of the most overrated features in Fortnite. You can click this video on screen right now to learn about that.